Session 1010. Good evening. We will indeed at least begin with the questions which are being asked, though I will answer them in my own way. And I answer them also out of politeness, and also because part of the answers will add to some of our own discussions. I will also, though not necessarily at this session, but in this session or the next session, have some remarks concerning the man who asked for the answers. I will answer now. The first question, I presume, refers to growth in the terms in which growth is usually considered. A coming toward maturity in terms of physical and mental approach to a hoped for fulfillment. In these terms, and giving the simplest explanation, since your friend is not well acquainted with our previous discussions, my late growing up period occurred in Denmark, in the same approximate period as one given previously for a previous life of your own, Joseph, and of Robert's. That was the last time I grew up, in what was a town called Truth. Rob, do you want to give me the years on that? They said, I will continue. In terms of maturity, I did not fulfill myself at that time. I am still growing as far as value fulfillment is concerned. Growing up, to your way of thinking, implies a growth or expansion also of physical stuff. The value fulfillment of which I speak carries no such connotation. As to what I love, I find that question itself has many complications. I love the inquiring consciousness in whatever form it may appear. This is the simplest, most direct, and spontaneous answer that I could possibly give. Another thought here is the love of continuing creation, which is continually formed by, through, and because of inquiring consciousness. Inquiring consciousness, is, as you know, always individualized, and it is because of this amazing diversity that so many of forms are possible. Everything that is a materialization of aware, individualized, inquiring consciousness, and to love this is a personal, almost all-encompassing discipline and devotion. I say discipline because whenever individualized inquiring consciousness expresses itself in form, it not only expresses its spontaneity, and this is not contradictory, but even while expressing its spontaneity, it disciplines it. Form always implies a discipline. The love of individualized inquiring consciousness has always been my strength, and the source of my energy. As to the third question, I suggest you break, and I will answer it. I am, incidentally, giving fairly brief and spontaneous answers, as requested. Indeed, as for my not defining terms, it is impossible not to define terms. I express concepts directly, as you know. These must of necessity be broken down into words that follow one after another, for our communications to take place. As such, I must end up trying to use your language rather than my own. Words are quite ineffectual methods of communication. The question, when is the self born, would take many sessions to answer. As simply as possible, the inner self, with which the ego is only vaguely familiar, that self which is the inner strength, continuity, and identity that gives the ego its vital meaning. That inner self, dear friend, is constantly being born. There is no point in time as you know it. When the self is born, it is constantly in a state of becoming. It explains and develops in terms of value fulfillment in a way that has nothing to do with space and time. It develops again, as you know, Joseph and Ruber. It expands as an idea expands, taking up no space. The self may project itself into the dimensions of space and time, but the projection is a small part of its actuality. Even the uppermost or surface elements of the self with which you are familiar, the ego and the uppermost layers of the subconscious, even these cannot be said to be born at any given time, in time as you conceive it. The self, Mr. A.J., is more than you know. It is capable of intelligence that you do not use. It is capable of making distinctions finer than you now imagine. The self, as other sections of this material explains, has methods not only of perception, but of criticism and judgment, that man in general does not take advantage of nearly as much as he could. The self is limited only by its own idea of limitation. Man has always feared what he could not objectify. He has always tempted to objectify, to separate whatever realities he could from himself, to hold them in his hands, so to speak, so that he could observe and study them. Those things, those realities which were most intimately connected with himself, those realities which he could not objectify and hold in his hands, he feared. He attempted to deny the existence of such realities, yet he cannot. You cannot hold a psychological experience in your hand as you can a rock, though its weight may be indeed heavier than a rock. You cannot put it on a scale, though its color, to continue your knowledge, may be as gray. You cannot see a psychological experience as you can see a gray rock. A psychological experience may take up no space as a rock takes up space. But when a psychological experience happens, it may fill you up. Yet, you do not deny the existence of a psychological experience, though you cannot rip it apart from yourself and examine it with the physical senses. Still, it has its effect, and its validity is well known to every man. So also are there other realities that cannot be examined through the use of the physical senses, realities so close to the self that they cannot be separated from it and objectified. This does not mean that they do not exist, nor does it mean that vivid, valid, and definite evidence for their existence cannot be received, and evidence which will be accepted by the intellect. The method of investigation is simply different. I suggest you break. There must always be a balance maintained between spontaneity and discipline. A combination of intuition and discipline can be used with most valid and definite results as a tool for investigating those parts of the self which are so interwoven that they cannot be separated from the self. In a very actual respect, chemically, electromagnetically, extensions of any given self permeate your universe. For practical considerations, and to reduce the amount of data that need concern the self. Rather, arbitrary divisions are set up, where the self at one point is said to exist and at another is considered non-self. Outward extensions of the self can be more clearly objectified, the concentration at the outward extensions being less, and identity correlations being kept in more concentrated areas within the boundaries of the physical self. The eye sees, but it cannot see itself. In like manner, the self is, but is not consciously able to examine that which it is. Therefore, man must take his abilities and travel inward, since going outward will not allow him to perceive the inner portions of himself. He has not done so to any great extent. Until most recently, he would not admit the existence of anything unless he could objectify it. Now, even in his scientific studies, he discovers that his senses have often misled him. His precious solid objects, for example, found to be solid only to his senses, an appearance given by the limitations of his sensual perceptions. It is not that the senses are not to be trusted, merely that they are trustworthy only within the framework of certain definite limitations. I am going to end our session. For your information, Joseph, I was born in that existence in your year, approximately 1486, and lived most of that life in a town called Trèves, in the eastern part of the country, as a merchant dealing in spices. I was indeed rather spicy myself. My kindest regards to Rupert and yourself, and my regards to the man who asked that the questions be given to me. He lived 2 other lives, one in Spain, approximately 1341, and one in England in the 1800s, this one as a banker in London. He as a personality has often been in the position of being distrustful of strong elements of compassion within himself in this life. Robert, can you give us his entity name? She said, and alternates between an over-reliance on discipline on the one hand and intuition on the other, not yet able to wield the two, so that they become 2 edges of one reliable tool. Strong abilities in both directions. However, entity name Salden, S-A-L-D-E-N. I will now end the session. I cannot obviously in one evening cover all the matters that have been suggested here. Rob said, "Good night, Seth."